Thank you, Rachel, and thanks, Matt. Thank you, Bobby. It's such a treat for me to be back here at the LBJ School. So when I found out that Rachel picked me to come back, they even hid the fact that this is part of a whole cyber barbecue invitation. Best brisket of my life. We're now upgrading the collaboration between Stanford and the Strauss Center to cyber chocolate. So I've been enjoying my chocolate chip cookie. I am so delighted to be back here. This is one of my all-time favorite institutions, even before the barbecue. Let me just add one other thing. Rachel mentioned this book. As all academics know, we're always writing books. It's really nice to be finishing a book. So I'm now at the point where they won't allow me to make any changes, and so I'm celebrating that. What I want to talk about today is the changing cyber landscape. Now, some of this, some of you know, and some of this probably some of you don't know. So I want to try to level the playing field a little bit, and then I'm going to toss the really hard technical questions to Admiral Inman. What I want to do is put all of the current events, and they're changing very quickly, into some context. So this is my what a difference a decade makes slide. If you look on the far left of this slide, this is a smiling Robert Mueller and John Negroponte, then the Director of National Intelligence and the FBI Director. They are giving their annual threat assessment to Congress, and I think the reason they're smiling is that the threat assessment in 2007, just a little over 10 years ago, does not mention the word cyber once. Right? So this is the last serious threat assessment where there's not one word devoted to cyber. If you fast forward 5 years to 2012, you have then Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta talking about a very different cyber threat. So all of a sudden in 2012, cyber now vaults to the top 3 threats listed in the annual threat assessment that the DNI is giving to Congress. And Secretary Panetta very deliberately goes on board the USS Intrepid, the aircraft carrier museum, and warns of a cyber Pearl Harbor. So there he's really talking about the possibility that a cyber attack could have physical consequences, could take down critical infrastructure. He talks about disabling the power grid, the financial system, transportation networks, the ability of cyber attacks to lead to contaminated water supplies, and creating crisis and damage akin to September 11th and the terrorist attacks on that day. So that's from 2007 to 2012. Fast forward another 5 years and we get James Clapper, the intelligence assessment that finds Russian election interference and influence operations. As many of you know, in January of 2017, Director Clapper revealed or declassified that the CIA, the National Security Agency, and the FBI all agreed with high confidence, right, those are important words, that the Putin regime directly ordered a multifaceted campaign to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process and to influence the outcome of the 2016 presidential election. Now, of course, this story is still ongoing. And in November, if you haven't seen it, you should tune in. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence held an extraordinary hearing where the general counsels of Twitter and Facebook and Google were all appearing, not their CEOs, but their general counsels. And of course, it was revealed that the extent of election influence operations was even larger than those companies had known or publicly acknowledged. Just to give you some sense of that, Twitter testified that they found 2,700 accounts controlled by the Russians and 36,000 suspected Russian bots, accounts that automatically generated more than 1 million election-related tweets that received 288 million impressions during the final 10 weeks of the presidential election. Now, Google's general counsel testified that Google had discovered Russian agents had uploaded more than 1,000 YouTube videos about divisive social issues like gun control, Black Lives Matter, and the like. And then, of course, Facebook revealed that Kremlin-instigated content, whether by Facebook groups or purchased ads, had reached an estimated 126 million Americans. That's more than a third of our population. But of course, the story is still unfolding. And now, of course, we know more recently that Cambridge Analytica, a political consulting firm linked to the 2016 Trump campaign, took advantage of Facebook's lax data privacy rules for app developers and used a questionnaire that was clicked on by 270,000 users to access the data of 50 million of their Facebook friends. Right? So this is lots of questions about the connections of Cambridge Analytica to the Trump campaign, lots of questions about the extent to which this use of personal information from 50 million Facebook friends violated Facebook rules. When did it violate? What the legal implications are. But of course, this is a very different world than anyone could have imagined in 2007, or even than Secretary Panetta imagined in 2012. This is a fast-changing threat landscape. It's changing at speeds that are really unprecedented in American history. So if we think about 10 years throughout the Cold War, you know, that was one former intelligence official put it to me, God love the Soviets, everything was on a 5-year plan. So it was bureaucracies collecting against bureaucracies. This is a much different, much faster moving threat. So what exactly is the cyber threat? Lots of discussion, right? We read the media reports and you hear it's everything from Cheeto-eating teen hackers to the government of North Korea. This is one of my favorites. This is Mafia Boy. For those of you who don't know the story, Mafia Boy was responsible for a series of cyber attacks in 2000 that disabled a number of websites in Northern California, including Yahoo, which tells you how long ago it was because they were the top search engine in the world when they were attacked, CNN and some other sites. The FBI investigates, and when they finally find the perp, Mafia Boy, he turns out to be a 15-year-old teen who was caught when he was spending the night with his friends and watching the movie Goodfellas. But you can't make this stuff up, right? So yes, there are teen hackers, and there are lots of stories about how worried should we be about these types of threats. But we also have non-state actors like Anonymous that hack for a variety of reasons, sometimes just to showcase their skills, sometimes just because they can, sometimes for ideological reasons. And then we also have, of course, criminals, and we have state actors as well, and I call them the big four, right? China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, with very sophisticated cyber capabilities. So this is one of my favorite cartoons. For those of you who can't see it in the back, this is a Chinese parade. You have the ICBMs, the medium-range missiles, and back here you have the hackers with their plastic pocket protectors. So the threat landscape is quite varied. And how do we make sense of this? Well, one of the challenges of making sense of the cyber threat landscape is that the terms themselves are analytically murky. They're confusing. What does cyber mean? Right? Essentially, it's putting together any kind of an event by the transmission mechanism. So it occurs over digital networks or platforms. So imagine if I said to you that we should be very concerned about a new class of threats called vehicle-borne threats. And the category vehicle-borne threats includes everything from terrorists exploding truck bombs to invasions with tanks to carjackings, right? Now, you'd look at me like I was crazy because these things have nothing to do with one another, but they all occur by vehicles. That is the same analytic mistake we've made with cyber. We lump all sorts of things together, the theft of your credit card information at Target, the breach of your personal data at the Office of Personnel Management, North Korea's attack on Sony Pictures Entertainment, and massive theft of intellectual property and potential sabotage of American military weapon systems, all lumped together by this word we call cyber. And so it's hard to actually make priorities when you have such a disparate set of activities lumped analytically in the same category. The word attack is also very problematic. If someone steals your credit card in a store, you don't say you've had a robbery attack. If someone commits espionage and takes a document out of a prime minister's safe, you don't say that's an espionage attack, right? It's theft and espionage. But in cyberspace, we call these things attacks. And the word attack connotes that the government should do something about it, right? Words matter because they set public expectations about what governments should do, and they also set thresholds of particular government actions, authorities that come into play when you label something in a certain way. So our language, this is not just a professor being picky here, right? Our language really matters in obscuring or illuminating the sort of scope of the cyber threat landscape. So I'm going to vastly oversimplify what is a complicated landscape and suggest that there really are 5 different types of cyber threats, right? It's stealing, spying, disrupting, destroying, and this was just put on here in the past year, deceiving. And I'll spend more time on that in a minute. So theft is a pretty straightforward one. In 2014, CSIS estimated the global cost of cyber theft of intellectual property and crime to be about $575 billion. That's equivalent to the GDP of Sweden. More recent estimates suggest that globally, cyber crime is now more profitable than the illicit drug trade. We're talking big business with cyber theft. Spying also is fairly straightforward, talked about a lot in the press. Of course, I know many of us in this room were victims of the OPM breach, which is largely believed to have been attributed to China. The theft of more than 22 million highly classified records, including security clearance forms from the Office of Personnel Management. Right? So this is just one of many examples of cyber espionage. Now, of course, our cyber landscape also makes insider threats far more damaging in scale and speed than they have historically been also. So if we think about comparing over time what one malicious insider can do, one of the most notorious counterintelligence examples of a traitor is, of course, Robert Hanssen. Robert Hanssen worked at the FBI for many years, had a very senior job in counterintelligence at the FBI, but he betrayed his country and was caught eventually passing secrets first to the Soviets and then to the Russians over a period of more than 20 years. Now he did this and passed along documents, thousands, several thousand documents in the old-fashioned way, literally in dead drops underneath a Virginia bridge, right? But it took Hanssen years and years, right, to be able to take out a few thousand documents and pass them to adversaries. Compare Robert Hanssen to Edward Snowden, right? Contractor for the NSA, who is estimated to have passed along or made public 1.5 million documents in a matter of months. Speed and scale for espionage, including insider threats, that is really unprecedented in modern times. So that's the theft piece. Disruption is what Leon Panetta was talking about, Cyber Pearl Harbor. We still read a lot about the vulnerability of electric power grids. Recent news reports that the Russians have actually been infiltrating our electrical grid system as well. Real concerns about disruption of systems and critical infrastructure, most of which is owned and operated by the private sector. Fourth is destruction. And here I categorize disabling military systems in times of conflict. I can tell you that one cabinet official came to Stanford about 1.5 years ago and said that they were concerned that they didn't know which systems, major weapons platforms they had, were most vulnerable and which weren't. Right? That's pretty disturbing. When we think about the move to digital systems and our weapons systems, in the same way that your car is mostly a driving computer, the F-35 is mostly a flying computer, think about the cyber vulnerabilities of our weapons systems. And we also know from news accounts in the past year or so that there appears to be a lot of at least testing about things like GPS spoofing. So there's some speculation that the Russians were behind the GPS spoofing of some merchant ships. So the ships believed they were using GPS to go in a certain direction, and the GPS looked like it was all working fine, only the ships didn't go where they were expected to go, right? So interfering with GPS guidance of ships is certainly a development that we should be concerned about. So destruction or disruption of military capabilities in times of conflict is a growing concern for cybersecurity. And then finally, of course, there's the deception operation. And I have a lot more to say about that, so I'll come back to that one in a minute. Let me take a little bit of time to talk about the 3 ways in which cybersecurity threats are fundamentally different than other national security threats that the United States has confronted. Now, there are lots of ways in which they're different, but I want to focus on the 3 most important ways that give the most heartburn, I think, to policymakers and academics trying to understand how we can advance policy interests. The first is that in cyber, the United States is both the most powerful country in cyberspace and the most vulnerable country in cyberspace at the same time. Now, the military likes to talk about domains. I am very fortunate. I run the War College Fellows Program at the Hoover Institution. So we get these wonderful fellows from every service that come to Stanford for a year. And so my military fellows often like to talk about domains. There's the air domain, the sea domain, the land domain. And those with the most capabilities in those traditional domains are considered the most powerful. You have the most aircraft carriers, you have the quietest submarines, you have the most advanced aircraft platforms. You're considered the most powerful in that domain. But that's not true in cyberspace. Why isn't it true? Because we are more digitally connected here in the United States than any other country in the world. We rely on digital systems for our military, for our commerce, for our education, right? For our social interaction, for our civil society. We are so vulnerable because we are so connected. Now, when North Korea hacked Sony Pictures, it became a national security incident that involved the highest levels of the United States government. But when North Korea's internet went down in an attack that was reportedly conducted by the United States, not a whole lot happened. Why? Because at the time, North Korea had a whopping total of 28 websites. Right? Shutting down the internet in one of the world's least connected countries, one of the world's poorest countries, where only 10% of the population owns a cell phone, and they use cell phones at night for electricity because the power delivery is so uncertain. Shutting down the internet in what could have been a reciprocal event didn't do much. We are asymmetrically vulnerable to cyber attacks. At the same time, we're the most powerful actor in cyberspace. That's different compared to other national security threats. So that's difference number 1. Difference number 2, the government can't go it alone. So in most national security threats, there's cooperation that has to happen with the private sector, but not nearly to the degree that it's required for cyber threats. Now, in every other realm, the government is considered, this is where I'm going to get a little political sciencey on you, the government is considered the legitimate monopoly provider of security. Right? Legitimate monopoly provider. So if you think about, if you're worried about crime in your neighborhood, you call the police. The police are the legitimate monopoly provider of security to protect you in your neighborhood. If we're worried about military threats to our interests or to our safety at a national level, we call the military. Right? It's the legitimate monopoly provider of security. But that's not true in cyberspace either, because 85% of our critical infrastructure is owned and operated by the private sector. Whose job is it to protect .com or .edu, right? It's not the Pentagon's job to protect those domain names, right? Whose job is it? So we have to have the cooperation of the tech industry and critical infrastructure firms in order to increase cybersecurity at a national level. And yet, as we talked about a little bit this morning, that trust between industry, particularly in Silicon Valley where I live, and the US government is really problematic. It's after the 1-2 punch of the Snowden revelations, of NSA activities, and the Apple FBI debate. One of the initiatives that I've been running at Stanford with my cyber partner in crime, Herb Lynn, is what we call a project to bridge the suit-hoodie divide. So we often talk about track 2 efforts between the United States and foreign governments that are quiet, non-official, but connected to official discussions about, say, nuclear risk between the US and Russia or the US and China. Well, we believe that we need a track 2 between the suits and the hoodies, right? Between Silicon Valley and Washington, D.C. And I will say, when Ash Carter came to Stanford to unveil the Pentagon cybersecurity strategy, I did give him a hoodie that said Stanford on it to help him with his translation of words. So there is this trust deficit in the wake of Snowden and the Apple FBI case. And we're doing what we can behind the scenes to bring people together to try to repair that trust deficit. I want to share 2 anecdotes that just give you an idea of how serious this deficit is. A few years ago, we created a cyber boot camp at Stanford, and Bobby's been one of our all-star faculty for the boot camp. So our first one, we had congressional staffers, Republicans and Democrats, House and Senate, all the relevant oversight committees. And we brought them out and wanted them to have informal, off-the-record discussions with tech leaders as part of this cyber education. So we went to a major tech company whose name you would well recognize, and one of the senior executives there said out loud to these congressional staffers, "I consider the National Security Agency to be the same as the People's Liberation Army. They are both attacking my networks all the time, and I have to defend my customers against the US government as much as I have to defend them against China." Wow. So jaws dropped and cell phones started dialing back to Washington about how much work needed to happen to repair that trust, right? So this is the kind of comment that you won't get necessarily in a congressional hearing or a formal meeting, but you will get if you create the right conditions for people to talk candidly. It scared the pants off of some of our congressional staffers. Let me share one other anecdote. In the midst of the Apple FBI controversy, we brought out some senior Justice Department officials to meet with tech leaders. And one of the tech leaders said, this is before we even sat down, to the Justice Department folks, "So are you going to serve me papers before they serve us our salad?" Right, so I kind of hit him on the shoulder and said, at least wait till dessert before you really dig into the Justice Department folks. The point is that this is a very, very serious breach of trust. And as I said this morning, the perhaps one silver lining on Facebook's current troubles is that there's a renewed understanding, and you can feel it in the Valley already, that these social media platforms are being used for nefarious purposes by foreign actors, and the US government doesn't look so bad anymore. So that may be changing. So the government can't go it alone. Big difference number 2. How to figure out that collaboration piece between, in particular, tech industry leaders and the US government is a critical challenge moving forward, and that's different than other national security threats. Third big difference, the attack surface. In cyberspace, the attack surface is huge, and it's getting bigger all the time. As you know, the good guys and bad guys on the internet are all connected. There are no safe places, there are no safe communities. You can't put walls or locks or fences to keep the good guys and the bad guys apart. We're all out there together in cyberspace. The internet wasn't designed to be secure. It was designed to be open and convenient. And it was originally designed so a handful of researchers, the first message between UCLA and Stanford, could share information with each other. They already knew each other, and they trusted each other. Except today, by my latest count, 48% of the world is on the internet, right? And that's growing every day. Thanks to the Internet of Things and all those wonderful devices that we can use to navigate or adjust our thermostat or remind us of what we need to buy, or our Fitbits, right? Thanks to the Internet of Things, there are more Internet-connected devices today than human beings on the planet. Right? And by 2020, more people will have cell phones than running water or electricity. So connectivity is here to stay. We're not going to go backwards when it comes to connectivity. So this Internet of Things and connectivity can be wonderful, but the dark side of connectivity is vulnerability. Anything that's smart is vulnerable. Anything. So there's always a weakness that nobody's ever heard of. So Bobby's heard me say this before, but technologists often use a rule of thumb in code that for every 2,500 lines of code, there's usually one inherent vulnerability, a weakness that the coder didn't think about, right? It's not maliciously put in the code, it's just nobody really thought about it, you don't get rewarded for making good code, right? So one for every 2,500 lines. Maybe it's 1,000, maybe it's 2,000, but you get the order of magnitude. So now imagine that all these nefarious cyber actors out there, the non-state actors, the teens of eating Cheetos, the state-based actors, non-state terrorist groups, they're all out there penetrating, trying to test those vulnerabilities. So if you imagine that code is a chain link fence, and there's one weak or missing link every 2,500 links, and now these bad guys are out there searching constantly for that missing link. I always say they're like the velociraptors in Jurassic Park. Remember them? Constantly testing to see how they can get through. That's the world in which we live. And now think about all the lines of code that power the devices we all love so much. So my Android phone runs on 12 million lines of code. That's nearly 5,000 vulnerabilities inherent just sitting there in the code, if the math is roughly right. Windows operating system, 40 million lines of code. So when you get those messages to patch on Tuesday, because as computer security people will tell you, Patch Tuesday is followed by Exploit Wednesday. So all of our fancy devices are run on code. And we think about consumer products that are now connected to the internet. We'd rather be connected than protected. Right? My favorite example of connected versus protected is Hello Barbie. Hello Barbie came out a couple years ago. Hello Barbie has a belt buckle that you can push, and she will engage in conversation with your child. She will remember what your child says, so because of the use of AI. And by the way, your child's voice is stored in the cloud. And so Hello Barbie will say, "Hello Bobby, is your brother still bothering you?" Right? Because it makes for a more pleasant or interaction with your child. What could possibly go wrong, right, with a device like this in the hands of a child using artificial intelligence storing your child's voice in the cloud? So you can imagine someone having a Hello Barbie that says, "Is your mom home? What's your credit card PIN number?" Right? This is Hello Barbie. So we'd rather be connected than protected. And then, of course, as we all know, we are the weakest links. Humans are always the weakest links when it comes to cybersecurity. I will share just two examples on this score. One is in a few years ago, the Department of Homeland Security ran a test where it dumped a bunch of thumb drives in a parking lot of a classified facility to see what would happen. And of the people that picked up the thumb drive, so not everyone picked it up, but of the people that picked up the thumb drive, 60% of them put it into their classified computer, okay? Compromising potentially that machine. And if the thumb drive had a logo on it, didn't matter what the logo was, just any kind of official looking logo, the percentage was even higher, right? Just put that sucker right into their computer. A couple years ago, we had a cyber summit at Stanford where President Obama came. So this was a lot of leaders in the Valley came. You had to be heavily credentialed, a lot of security. You had to wear those big badges. And I'm sitting in the business school at a break, and I watched this. One of the VIPs, heavily credentialed person for the cyber summit, walked into the business school cafeteria and went up to a random person and said, my cell phone battery is dying. Would you mind if I plug it into your computer? And the business school student said, sure, go ahead. Plug the phone right into the computer at the cybersecurity summit. Right? So humans are the weakest link in cybersecurity, and our attack surface is only getting larger. So let me turn to deception. Now you guys, when I first put this together a while ago, this wasn't as well known as it is now, but since it happened in Texas, I thought I'd include it. So this is about deception as the newest challenge. If we think about historically, during World War II and the Cold War, deception was primarily an elite level game, where governments were trying to deceive other governments to gain advantage, whether it's decision advantage or diplomatic advantage or military advantage. Right, so World War II, the invasion of Normandy was one of the greatest examples of successful deception, where the British basically compromised the entire German spy network and used it to relay fake information about Allied invasion plans to convince Hitler that the invasion would be at Calais instead of Normandy. Now they went to, as you know, elaborate lengths to make this deception complete. There was a fictitious army group called the First United States Army Group, led by General Patton. They had dummy landing craft, they had inflatable items and fake storage depots, they had fake airfields, they even put fake tire tracks in the ground, just in case there was reconnaissance by the Germans that might pierce this deception. The deception worked so well that even after the troops landed at Normandy, Hitler did not immediately send troops or reinforcements because he was convinced it was a diversion and that the real landing was still going to be at Pas-de-Calais. That is deception at an elite level, right? Leaders deceiving other leaders. Same thing in the Cold War. So, classic example there, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Khrushchev really wanted to have a fait accompli and went to great lengths to hide the operation where he was building nuclear missile sites in Cuba. Now, the deception was so complete that Soviet ship crews were not even told where they were going originally until they reached the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So they're carrying the nuclear materials, and it's now been declassified that the protocol was they would travel to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. They were told they were going to a cold weather climate, so they packed all the wrong gear. In the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the captain would unseal an envelope in the presence of a KGB officer. Now, inside that envelope were the instructions of the real coordinates in Cuba, with instructions at the end that said, after familiarizing yourself with the contents of this document, destroy it. Today is a different world. Now deception is not just aimed at leaders, it's aimed at all of us. Deception is reaching into the mass publics of foreign countries to try to deceive large swaths of the public, and that is new. So this is just one example that was revealed in those Senate hearings I talked about in November. This was Senator Richard Burr's Cuban Missile Crisis moment, where instead of Adlai Stevenson unveiling the giant posters of U-2 photos revealing missile sites in Cuba, Senator Burr revealed these giant posters about how the Russians were inciting conflict among the American people. So what this is there's two Facebook groups. One was called The Heart of Texas, which was not created by Texans. It was created by Russians in the Internet Research Agency. It soon grew into the most popular Texas secession page on Facebook. At one point in 2016, there were more followers of the Heart of Texas Facebook group than the official Texas Democrat and Republican Facebook pages combined. More than 250,000 followers. At the same time, the Internet Research Agency created the United Muslims of America, also had hundreds of thousands of followers, more than 300,000 followers. Not created by Muslims of America, created by Russians, right? Now, both of these groups decided that they were going to hold an event on the same day, at the same time, May 21st, at 12 o'clock, at the same location in Houston, right? So this is what you got, right? This is virtual deception creating real protests of real Americans in Houston, Texas, all instigated by the Kremlin. Right? This is deception on a mass scale. Right? So, and now that's the good news. This is the bad news. Those are Stone Age tools compared to what's coming. So this is what originally got me interested in looking more deeply at artificial intelligence. Nvidia is a company in Silicon Valley. In October, it released this report, a very influential technical report that showed that Nvidia researchers could use advanced artificial intelligence and a technique called generative adversarial networks, or GAN, to create real-looking images of fake celebrities. These people do not exist. Right? These images are created completely by machines. And what the researchers found was with enough data of real celebrities, 30,000 images, the machines could learn how to make pictures that look more realistic by including things like facial hair and jewelry. Right? So the basic idea, I am not a technologist, I hasten to add that, so don't ask me much about how it really works, right? Everyone will have to answer those questions. Is with GAN, you have two different neural networks competing against each other. One that creates an image and the other that's trying to detect whether that image is real or false. And so as they compete against each other, the images get better and better. And there's no way to unpack it to know what was authentic in the first place. So it's not as though there's some trademark where you can figure out what was fake and what wasn't. These are all completely fake images of celebrities. Okay? Now, Bobby, of course, has written about a far sexier application of deception, quite literally, using AI-assisted fake porn, which is much more interesting than just celebrity images. It uses a similar idea, but much less sophisticated. Uses machine learning algorithms to splice somebody's face, could be you, could be your mom, could be a celebrity, on the video image of adult film actors or actresses. Okay? Now, unless you think this is an unlikely thing, and it'd be really hard to get your face, think about all the selfies we post, including Cyber Barbecue. Like, we gotta watch out for that. I don't want that to be in a bad film. Not Americans, people have uploaded, you ready? 24 billion selfies in 1 year. So imagery about ourselves, because we love to take selfies and post it, is readily available for this kind of manipulation. So, and now it gets even scarier, because my friends in computer science say that we're already really good at creating fake audio that sounds exactly like your voice and is indistinguishable from your voice. And now we're getting to a point where we will soon, estimates range within 2 years roughly, have fake video that is so realistic you won't actually be able to tell whether it's fake or real. So what I have here is a little clip I'm going to play by the University of Washington. There's a research team there that's doing a lot of work on using artificial intelligence and lip syncing to create fake video. But I want to just set the scene a little bit before I go to the video, which is that what you're going to see is a little clip of President Obama. And it's not as though they just splice together different statements that he made at different times. What you're going to see is completely fabricated using artificial intelligence and lip syncing technology to make the image of him move as though he's actually speaking. Okay? He didn't actually say these things, right? They're making him say these things. Okay. So just bear with me while I go to the right part of the video. Let's see if we can get this bigger.
Given this audio as input,
it's been less than a week since the Davies.
We're going to skip to the good stuff. Let's see at 540. And you're going to see a impersonator use his voice too.
A lot of kids, the doors that have been open to me aren't open to them.
We can even create an Obama video from voice impressionists.
Here we go. President Barack Obama. When you giving a speech, make sure you use a lot of pauses and speak in a very weird tempo. Down and up, up, down, down.
We show an application that creates a short summary video from a longer speech by manually selecting the desired text to include. Note that the result is completely seamless. While our results are similar to Butholsis et al. From Zegart 2012, they required the original footage, and we do not.
Hey everybody,
We made up the footage.
today 20 million more American adults know the financial security of health insurance. On top of that, another 3 million more kids have coverage than when I took office. Most of us don't get our health care through the marketplace. We get it through our job, or through Medicare or Medicaid. And what you should know is that you now have free preventive care. There are no more annual or lifetime limits on essential health care. Women can get free checkups.
So you get the idea. And if you look at the whole video, you'll see the evolution of the lip-syncing AI technology so that it gets better and better over time. So what does this all mean? Let me give you 3 possible scenarios for the future. Right? 3 examples of how we're going to be dealing with mass deception in the gray zone short of conflict. Okay. Imagine that there is video that the Iranian president, Rouhani, is discussing a clandestine nuclear program violating the Iran deal. It is fake, but there's no way to know it. Because at this point, remember, we can't reverse engineer this to figure out what's fake and what's not. Okay? So his denials cannot be believed. Imagine that there's surveillance video of a terrorist attack at a mall, right, in Minnesota or in Michigan or in Maryland. And the terrorist attack is not real, but the surveillance video makes it look like it is absolutely real. Twitter goes viral with video of the suspected terrorist. A manhunt ensues. The suspected terrorist is not a terrorist at all, but a local Pakistani-American college student. Okay? Or imagine this. Fake videos show that US troops are evacuating from South Korea. This prompts Kim Jong-un, who believes the United States is preparing for an attack, to launch a preemptive strike on Seoul or on Guam, triggering an escalation spiral into nuclear war. Now, if you think that this is far-fetched, consider this. In September of this year, fake evacuation orders for US military and their dependents stationed in South Korea did happen. Okay? These fake evacuation orders were issued over mobile phones and social media amidst high tensions between the US and North Korea after North Korea had just conducted its 6th nuclear test, and amidst the war of words between Kim Jong-un and President Trump, where President Trump declared that he was going to rain fire and fury on North Korea like the world had never seen. In the midst of this heightened tension, these fake evacuation orders go out to some US military and their dependents in South Korea, and US Forces Korea had to issue an alert saying that the order was fake and that there was no evacuation. Right? This is not nearly as far-fetched a scenario as you might believe. So at the end of the day, deception has always been a part of international relations. But the changing cyber threat landscape suggests that deception is going mass and deception is going big time in real time. And we are confronting a seriously different new world. On that really uplifting note, I'm going to stop and open it up for questions. Yeah.
I'll start us off. Will you talk about what you think the prospects are for international norms as part of the solution here? You might not be surprised to know, a little bit skeptical of that, but I'm interested in what you think.
Well, you're the norms expert, so I'm a political scientist, so I naturally think norms are much harder to develop probably than some others do. I'm naturally skeptical for two reasons. First, as you know, Bobby, we're talking about activity below the threshold of war, which is why there's such an incentive for states to use these kinds of capabilities. And that's where the norms are hardest to develop. It'd be one thing if we said, here's the taboo, here's the threshold. But particularly because there's been this gravitational pull to below the threshold where it's not clear what would trip the wire for a response, it's much harder to establish norms. Where we don't have a clear understanding of where the continuum is in order to be able to delineate, much less enforce those norms. And then the second is the incentive question, right? So right now it's the Wild West for the use of these techniques. And states have a good reason to use them because their other capabilities are more hamstrung. Weak states in particular have an incentive to use them because, as you all know, the United States spends more than the next several countries combined on our military. We have outmatched conventional forces, we have outmatched nuclear deterrent, and so adversaries naturally gravitate to their source of asymmetric advantage, and this is it. Yeah. Evelyn.
Thinking about where AI could take us. If I were to think about AI recognizing something as potential fake, to do an alert or to put a stamp on it that says probably false, possibly false, in real time.
So,
And who would do it?
so Herb Lynn we had a back and forth with Bobby on lawfare, which I would highly recommend. So Herb is a little more optimistic than I am, and his argument is technically the solution may lie with devices that create these images. So already cameras, for example, can create pictures that authenticate the image. This picture came from this camera at this date on this time. So you could imagine that that could be a partial solution. But my understanding is on the technical side, when it comes to video like this, it's much, much harder to do. And so some researchers have said, well, we can make it harder by making sure that there are, that you can demonstrate a pulse, right, in a video, or small indications that the image is actually real. But that's like putting the club on your car to keep the car thief from stealing it, right? It makes it a little bit harder, but not a lot harder. So the question is, how do we incentivize AI researchers to build the authentication into the process for generative adversarial networks? I can tell you, I'm going to betray my inside source at Stanford for what's being taught in AI, which is my son, who's a sophomore there in computer science. They are not being taught computer security in the AI sequence at Stanford. So this question about how do we bake it in instead of bolt it on, which is the solution, has not made its way, at least at Stanford in computer science, into the technical training in these AI courses. Yeah.
Amy, Paul Pope, I'm a professor here. We're doing a research project, I'm leading one right now, where we're looking at counterterrorism and how we were organized for it. And then we're sort of surprising some of the people we're interviewing by then, after they tell us the lessons from what we've learned for the last 15 years, we say, how do you think we're organized for cyber stuff? And so I wanted to ask you about, and by the way, we've gotten laughter and, knee slapping and completely, total skepticism by really inside people, National Security Council members, things like that about our how we're set up. If you were talking about the whole of society, even if you just go to the whole of government, if you go back to your previous research you did about how we were organized for certain problems, how well are we organized? I'm not talking about the policy, I'm talking about execution of countermeasures to this by the government.
Oh, boy, that's such a good question. I wish I had a good answer. I see a couple of tensions. I think it's much harder than counterterrorism.
Yeah.
Much, even within government, it's much harder. And there's the classic challenge of centralization versus innovation. You need to be able to coordinate, but you also want to be able to innovate. So how do we resolve that tension, particularly in the Pentagon, between having every force having its own cyber operators versus having one unified cyber operations force. So we have that tension, which is true across all policy domains. So that's the old problem that's still here. On top of that, we have the challenge of the fact that intelligence capabilities have to be brought to bear for cyber weapons to be effective, because they need to be targeted and they're often time limited. right? So a vulnerability can go away. And so there's a use it or lose it quality to offensive cyber weapons, right? So your F-16 is still going to work, but your cyber exploit may not tomorrow. And so, but there's a natural tension in the intelligence space between continuing to have access and then using a weapon that will reveal that may close off their future access. So we see this with the dual hat with NSA and Cyber Command. NSA always I feel funny saying this with Admiral Inman right here, but he'll tell me if I'm wrong. NSA always wants to err on the side of listening, right?
Absolutely.
Right, where the Pentagon has an incentive to act, right? So that's a fundamental tension in the organizational structure of how we think about cyber operations. And then on top of that, there's a third challenge, which is how do we then interface with the private sector? And there you have a gap. Those with the best skills are least able to have that relationship with the private sector. So there's a mismatch in capabilities and access between the government and the private sector. So DHS, FBI are the most frequent interlocutors with the private sector, but they don't bring the most capability to the fight when it comes to defense and any kind of active defense or retaliation. So, you've got the centralization, innovation piece, the watch versus action, and then the skills and access gap that really complicate, I think, how we think about organizing for effectiveness in cyber. Yeah.
There was some controversy earlier this year about whether the question of cyber attacks would merit mention in the nuclear posture review. I don't know what the facts of the matter are because I only read them on the internet. And so I'm not very sure where things stand. I wonder
was it Russia Today?
I wonder if you could comment on the appropriateness of raising the cyber question to the level that where it might possibly trigger a response using nuclear weapons.
So I understand the reasoning behind me. The nuclear posture review was done with a lot of thought. I may disagree with its findings, but I think we need to take seriously the rationale behind them. So I think the argument was we need to be able to go up the escalation ladder so that if there is an act of national significance, not clear what that is because it's hard to know in advance what that might look like, but if there is, that our adversaries know that we don't have to respond in kind. A cyber attack does not necessarily beget a cyber attack, that we reserve the right to use more robust retaliatory measures. So I understand the logic. My concern is that it makes it much more likely that either it makes it more likely that we will use nuclear weapons in retaliation for a cyber attack, or it makes that threat hollow. Right? Because at least public opinion polling by Sarah Krebs and others have shown that there is a psychological difference, at least currently, when this is not an elite poll, but a mass poll, that when the United States is attacked via cyber means, the impulse to retaliate kinetically is lower. Okay? So if that's the case, and we're now saying we reserve the right to retaliate with nuclear weapons when in fact we wouldn't, or there would be more hesitation to do so, now we've undermined our deterrent credibility. So I worry about that. So either option is pretty bad from my perspective. We either lower the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons or we're issuing hollow threats. So while I understand the rationale behind it, I don't think it works in practice. Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask a question more on the human side of this. What have you seen, whether it's with neuroscience studies or social capital, on where the human race is going in response to these new technologies? I'll give a couple examples here. So we've already seen that attention spans are way down, right? Sorry, kids. I see this with my students. I can't assign as much reading as I did 10 years ago. We just read less and less. It's all going to be instant. We've certainly seen that social inhibitions go down. People are willing to be just a lot nastier if you're hiding behind a Twitter handle or Facebook than you are necessarily face-to-face. But for this stuff to really work, people need to believe what they're seeing and then need to somehow act on it one way or another. And of course, the competing Texas Facebook rallies is a great example there. But Is there a chance also that this will so erode social capital and so raise levels of distrust and skepticism that we're looking at this kind of dystopian future where we all just sort of sit around on our computers not believing anything we see?
Oh, I thought I was a downer.
Okay. But at least we're not going out and then, betraying our country or something. So, yeah.
Dystopian future.
Yeah.
Agree or disagree?
Bad or awful. Yeah.
So I don't know the answer to it yet. One of the projects I'm really excited that we're going to start in the fall is I think we need to do more psychological research about what makes individuals more susceptible to manipulation than others and what undergirds trust. Because what I've read so far, and I am not a psychologist, but what I've read so far is very alarming, right? Which is you have polarization, political polarization of our country, coupled with the fact that what you see is an in-group, out-group affective response to information, right? So this is, I'm going to react emotionally to information that criticizes a group that I am affiliated with or that I approve, regardless of whether it's factually correct or not. And so I'm really worried about that dynamic. I don't think we understand enough about it. And that gets to the heart of how much can trust erode, particularly in democratic societies, where we've always thought that the answer to misinformation is more information. And so I think we're living in this paradox where there's more information than ever before and less credibility than ever before. I hope it's not a dystopian future. I'd like to think by banning laptops in my classroom, I'm raising the attention span of my students. But then they sneak on their cell phones, so we gotta fight that fight. But I am really worried about it. And I don't think we know the micro foundations of what we see manifesting sort of at an aggregate level. And that I think and one of the things we're going to do is bring in our colleagues from the business school who are advertising and marketing experts, right? Who know on the flip side, how do you get people to do things and buy products that you want, to understand how it can be used for nefarious nation-state purposes. So maybe I'll have an answer in a year, but I don't have one now. But hopefully it's not dystopian future.
Okay.
Yeah.
Talking about nefarious nation-state purposes, so I'm studying under Professors Chesney and Tate right now, and I'm writing a paper about Iranian capabilities. So you were talking about asymmetric vulnerabilities. On the flip side of that is asymmetric capabilities. So we're seeing states who aren't conventionally powerful or as powerful are now a major threat to the United States. How do we handle that? How do we adjust our own foreign policy to account for the fact that these states that we didn't have to think about as much now have a lot more capacity?
So in some ways, I think the answer is the same regardless of whether it's a powerful state or a relatively weaker state, which is that we have to bolster our own cyber resilience and our own cyber defenses. But in addition to that, I think there's a lot of talk about cyber deterrence, and Herb and I arm wrestle over this a lot. I'm much more skeptical about the future of deterrence in cyberspace. But I do think as a general proposition, we need to have a tailored understanding for any kind of deterrence. What does an adversary value and how do we hold it at risk? And so the answer for Iran will unlikely be the same answer for North Korea, unlikely to be the same answer for Russia. And what they may value and what we can hold at risk may be something like visas for leaders, students to study in the United States. Right? It doesn't have to be in the same domain. So I think we need to think a little bit more about that. But you're absolutely right, and I'm sure Professors Tate and Chesney are right about this too, which is that we're seeing a proliferation of actors with capabilities, right? So we see a diffusion of capabilities, a lower barrier to entry, not just weak states, but non-state actors and individuals. And so that's a fundamentally different arena we're facing as well, right, with these asymmetric capabilities. Yeah.
Just one comment on the misinformation point that you were talking about. I did research early in my PhD about misinformation and Lodge and Tabor, and there's some psychologists that are really studying this deeply. But one of the points is that being misinformed is much more dangerous for democracy than an uninformed public, because statistically speaking, in the aggregate, an uninformed public is more likely to have just general noise, whereas a misinformed public is going to systematically make the wrong choices. But I was more curious about this idea. You spoke of this yawning gap between the suits and the hoodies and how to kind of bring this together, and kind of interdisciplinary, but I was wondering kind of more about an intra disciplinary. One of my colleagues I co-teach with in the School of Information, an identity management course, and he was a former Secret Service officer, and he said that one of his big struggles was that the other officers that he worked with didn't know what they were looking for. They would see signs of identity-related threats. He was working on identity theft, so they would find piles and piles of blank cards that had credit card information on it and wouldn't recognize it as evidence. And so the training level from hierarchy seems to be a big problem with law enforcement as well. Do you find that in the intelligence community, that the people on the ground aren't really as up to date with what they need to be looking for, maybe, as the higher ups?
So I think this is a huge problem with technology and policy generally, right? Which is that there are very few people who can translate the zeros and ones into English. And Mike Hayden has a great piece about this several years ago, I think it was in Security Studies, where he talks about the technical expert walks in and people think he's Rain Man, right? So, and so one of the things we've been hearing a lot about is that members of Congress, right, and their staffs don't have enough technical capabilities residing in their staff to be able to know what's plausible. So from a training perspective, this is my own view, I don't think you have to be cyber fluent, but you sure need to be cyber literate, right? To be able to understand what types of capabilities are plausible, what types of scenarios are plausible, and to begin to ask the right questions. This reminds me, you asked earlier about counterterrorism and the difference with cyber. This is a very strong similarity, I find. If we think about FBI Joint Terrorism Task Forces, a great idea, right? To bring people from different agencies with different perspectives to bear on the same set of challenges. Except that what happened to Joint Terrorism Task Forces? Well, they tended to be staffed by people who looked and behaved a lot like FBI special agents. So from the Pentagon, for example, the Defense Department tended to send people from the Defense Criminal Investigation Service who had law enforcement authorities, like an FBI special agent. And so in the Fort Hood terrorist attack, which I spent some time looking at, one of the reasons the task force member of the JTTF in Washington, D.C., one of the reasons why he missed what Nidal Hassan was, the significance of Nidal Hassan's communication, the shooter's communication with Anwar Awlaki, thank you, I had a senior moment there, was because he didn't know what he was looking for, because he was looking for waste, fraud, and abuse, which was his background. And he decided that because Nidal Hassan was using his real name in these communications with a known spiritual sanctioner of terrorism, he must be up to legitimate research and not nefarious activity. So you can't just add people and stir. If you bring your old analytic lenses to the problem, you're actually not going to get an interagency perspective where you're looking at the information and seeing something different than the person sitting next to you. So that is the same challenge, except I think it's exacerbated by the fact that, you know, the technical side seems pretty impenetrable, right? So to up our cyber awareness and literacy is the first step to being able to harness those diverse analytic perspectives to be able to look and find information in a useful way. Yes, sir.
I want to talk about a failure looming much larger than the session today. And that's that I tried to recruit Professor Zegart to UT Austin in 2005, and I lost her to Stanford. Stanford's great success. It was a terrific session.
So thank you. My heart, I told you this morning, I still have a little piece in my heart here. If it weren't for a very good, deft diplomat, doctoral advisor named Condi Rice, I would be here. So you can arm wrestle with her.
She was better.
So do we have time for a couple more questions? Yes, sir.
One of the effective tools we've had against criminals, non-state actors, even state actors, in Treasury's ability to track funds, follow money, with the use of cryptocurrencies for money laundering, payments, transfers. How does that affect our capabilities here?
Boy, I wish I had an answer to that question. I am not a cryptocurrency expert. I have a colleague you should invite named John Villasenor, who's an electrical engineering professor at UCLA. and a Hoover fellow who is an expert on cryptocurrency, and he could answer that for you. I just don't know how it fits in. I wish I did. Yes, sir.
A while back, there used to be a problem with electrical fires. And to a large extent, this was solved by essentially putting in place standards which manufacturers had to meet and certifications they had to go through. Now, since we're on the verge of the Internet of Things, one way of making sure that you don't have an explosion of the Barbie example you gave be establishing certifications or standards for new devices.
That's certainly an approach. This is where I get to say I'm not a lawyer, but maybe one day I will be.
There's a discussion of that exact idea with reference all the way back to the original effort to keep toasters from bursting into flames on the most recent episode of Stuart Baker's Cyber Law podcast.
Okay.
I can give you a link.
Yeah, please do.
I'll click on that link as soon as I'm done here too. Right. So this question of regulation is a really important and interesting one. But it's also a global marketplace. So even if we solve the problem domestically in the United States, it's not going to solve the problem. And given that code is shared, you can see how, and there are network effects to to many of these devices. You can see the problem is bigger than just American regulatory frameworks. There was in the back, yes.
Yeah. So you spoke about how difficult it is becoming when which videos are fake and which videos are real, and this grows in terms of like national security concerns. But this is all due to technological advances, of course. But by that same token, wouldn't that also mean that technological advances also mean that it would be easier to determine the authenticity of said videos? You stated earlier that there are cameras that exist that are able to determine which photos are fake or not at this point. And we see this in programs such as Photoshop and such. Do you suppose the same will happen with videos in terms of reverse engineering and would thereby almost increase safety measures intentionally?
Only in some cases. So in the cases that Bobby has written about in his great lawfare piece, where you're talking about some machine learning taking a still frame of your face and putting it on someone else's body in a porn video, that is easier to reverse engineer and find, because you're taking a still image which has background, and you can figure out, right, it's possible to figure out the splicing of that image onto the video. With generative adversarial networks, or the Gann technology, that's really only taken off, I mean, it's taken off in the past 4 years, but remember that Nvidia report was just this fall. You can't do that, because the image is born fake. It's not that you're taking a real image and doctoring it, it's that you're creating something from whole cloth that is not real. And the process by which you're creating it is you have a generating neural network and a discriminating neural network. And they're in competition with each other to constantly refine that image. And they can't explain, right? So explainable AI is a big challenge, right? Can we have AI where you can look at the steps by which you get from one image to another? We're not very far along with explainable AI. So I'm probably not doing justice to the technology. But when an image is born out of a process that doesn't start with really anything, right? It's just creating an image from a vast repository of inputs. There's no way to say what was originally born fake, because the whole thing was born fake. Right? So it actually, in that particular most sophisticated type of AI, it's not possible yet to be able to tell an authentic video from a fake video. Okay? So it depends on the AI, right? It depends on how sophisticated you are. Yeah.
Let me represent the general public for this question. Since we're the most powerful in the cyber world, what keeps us from responding in a way that makes it so painful that state actors will think twice or three times about doing what they've done to us?
So I think a couple things induce restraint. First, if we use those capabilities, we reveal those capabilities. So we think about the Stuxnet virus. Can be once it's in the wild, it can be reverse engineered much more easily and used against us. So we want to hold those capabilities in reserve, because if we use them, we may lose them. That's number one. Number two, I think Pentagon officials have expressed to me rightly so, a concern about what does the escalation ladder look like, right? So we hit back in kind, what happens next? And because, as I mentioned, we're asymmetrically vulnerable, if we do a tit for tat with an adversary, we're likely to lose at that end of the spectrum in a pure cyber tit for tat world, right? Because our power goes out or our financial system goes down, and then what do? Now we're going up rungs of the escalation ladder, and where does that head? Concern and uncertainty about escalation dynamics in cyberspace, I think, are one of the factors inducing restraint. You look unsatisfied with that explanation. But I think there's a, I feel your pain, because there's a sort of concern that we're sitting here and we're not doing enough. And how can we do more? And the challenge is, how can we do more to dissuade this kind of activity without making it worse, right? And that's a hard problem to solve.
I just wonder if you could comment on the reported leaks of the NSA's hacking tools and the consequences of that.
Yeah. So this gets into the encryption debate and fuels criticism that if the NSA can't keep its secrets safe, why should any company allow a backdoor on its products so that only the NSA can use it? Right. So for those of you who haven't been following this, there's a shadowy group called the Shadow Brokers that apparently had access to some highly classified tools that the vulnerabilities that the NSA had collected and released them publicly, which has been very damaging. And so it raises some fundamental questions about the vulnerability equities process, so the process by which the NSA and the interagency process decides this is a vulnerability that we want to share with industry so they can patch it, or this is a vulnerability that we don't want to share so we have unique access to give America decision advantage, right? Again, hard problems to solve, but it's raised anew. How does the vulnerability equities process work? What considerations come into play when making those decisions? And how can we rely on this process at all if we're moving to a world where it's harder and harder and harder to keep those kinds of secrets safe with the insider threat that I mentioned? So it's a new world of challenges with respect to NSA vulnerabilities.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we should probably say thanks to our guest.